Sorry for the different setup. I'm visiting family right now, so I'm working from my aunt's office. I'm getting a totally new setup at my house, so the look of the show is going to be very different within the next week or so. All 12 people watching, stay tuned, and you'll see something very new. Uh, I wanted to talk a little bit about cliodynamics, which is what Peter Turchin calls his methodology, his approach to looking at history. And in this 2008 Nature article called Arise Cliodynamics, uh, he sort of outlines why he's taken this different approach and what he thinks it can offer to our society and why it's more valuable and necessary to what's going on in our world right now than, say, the standard way of looking at history. So let's talk a bit about this article. He begins, what caused the collapse of the Roman Empire? More than 200 explanations have been proposed, but there is no consensus about which explanations are plausible and which should be rejected. This situation is as risible as if in physics, phlogiston theory and thermodynamics coexisted on equal terms. This state of affairs is holding us back. We invest in medical science to preserve the health of our bodies, and in environmental science to maintain the health of ecosystems. Yet our understanding of what makes societies healthy is in the pre-scientific stage. Sociology that focuses on the past few years or decades is important. In addition, we need a historical social science because processes that operate over long time scales can affect the health of societies. It is time for history to become an analytical and even a predictive science. So it's time for history to become both analytical and predictive. That's not something that we usually hear, at least from a 20th century historian. Again, we mentioned Hegel and Marx and the sort of Abrahamic messianic view of history earlier, and that certainly has a predictive model. Marx and Hegel, you could call them analytical, but they weren't scientific, at least in the modern sense of the term, even though they claimed it. Many critics of Marx point out that his work is not falsifiable, and certainly that argument could be applied to Hegel. But what Peter Turchin is doing is quite different, and whether or not it's effective is a big question. It's clearly still in developmental stages. He mentions that every scientific discipline has its share of splitters who emphasize the differences between things and lumpers who stress similarities in search of organizing principles. And so he says lumpers dominate physics. In biology, splitters who care most for the private life of warblers or the intricate details of a chosen signaling molecule are roughly matched in numbers by lumpers, who try to find fundamental laws. Social sciences such as economics and sociology are rich in lumpers. Sadly, few are interested in applying analytical approaches to the past. History has an alarmingly small proportion of lumpers. That the average historian, he's saying, is, they're studying the Middle Ages or the antebellum South or the, civil rights era, something like that. They're not interested in these broader historical questions that could apply, for example, to all three eras, like Peter Turchin is, or like someone like maybe Marx might be. Marx was definitely a lumper, and so was Hegel, but and I think it could be, but you don't, in the discipline of history, you don't see that happen nearly as frequently, and I think this is part of why Peter Turchin is making waves. That historians we shouldn't just focus on the particular. Cliodynamics, he says, so Peter Turchin says, let history continue to focus on the particular. Cliodynamics, meanwhile, will develop unifying theories and test them with data generated by history, archaeology, and specialized disciplines. This idea, the development of unifying theories, again, nothing new. But the way they're being developed, the fact that they're being developed mathematically, that does seem quite new, or at least not altogether common. Um, and so Turchin wonders if it's feasible, um, and I think it's a really good question. After we see, one of the other critiques about Marx is that it just doesn't work. That his idea, his prediction of what was going to happen, this workers' revolution, etc., it didn't happen. So his science was bunk. And so the feasibility of a historical science, of this predictive historical science, well, that's certainly, it's something that should be questioned. And so the argument, says Peter Turchin, against the feasibility of such a proposal goes like this. Human societies are extremely complex. They consist of many different kinds of individuals and groups that interact in complex ways. People have free will and are therefore unpredictable. Moreover, the mechanisms that underlie social dynamics vary with historical period and geographical region. Medieval France clearly differed in significant ways from Roman Gaul, and both were very different to ancient China. It's all too messy, argue the naysayers, for there to be a unifying theory. And I think it's a pretty good argument, frankly. They have, the naysayers, as he calls them, certainly have a point there. Turchin says, though, that if this argument were true, there would be no empirical regularities. Any relationships between important variables would be contingent on time, space, and culture. However, Turchin says that several patterns cut across periods and regions. For example, agrarian pre-industrial states have seen recurrent waves of political instability. Not interstate warfare, but lethal collective violence occurring within states, ranging from small-scale urban riots, in which just a few people are killed, to full-blown civil war. This is just the sort of violence we need to understand. Many more people are killed today in terrorist campaigns, civil wars, and genocides than in wars between nations. Recent comparative research shows that agrarian societies experience periods of instability about a century long every 2 or 3 centuries. These waves of instability follow periods of sustained population growth. For example, in Western Europe, rapid population growth during the 13th century was followed by the late medieval crisis, comprising the Hundred Years' War in France, the Hussite Wars in the German Empire, and the Wars of the Roses in England. Population increase in the 16th century was followed by the crisis of the 17th century, the Wars of Religion and the Fronde in France, the 30 Years' War in Germany, and the English Civil War and Glorious Revolution. Similarly, population growth during the 18th century was followed by the Age of Revolutions, ranging from the French Revolution of 1789 to the Pan-European revolutions of 1848 and 1849. Such oscillations between population growth and instability have been termed secular cycles. Given the limitations of historical data, we need an appropriately coarse-grained method to determine the statistical significance and the generality of the pattern. The basic idea is to demarcate population growth and decline phases, and to count the instability incidents, such as peasant uprisings and civil wars, that occur during each phase. With my colleagues, I have collected quantitative data on demographic and social and political variables for several historical societies. Applying the above approach to 8 secular cycles in medieval and early modern England, France, the Roman Empire, and Russia, we find that the number of instability events per decade is always several times higher when the population was declining than when it was increasing. The probability of this happening by chance is vanishingly small. The same pattern holds for the 8 dynasties that unified China, from the Western Han to the Qing, and for Egypt from the Hellenistic to the Ottoman periods. Such strong regularity, he says, points to the presence of some fundamental principles. And now we're talking about agrarian societies. These are pre-industrial societies. Turchin says that obviously in an industrial society, this relationship between overpopulation and starvation, for example, it doesn't obtain in the same way as a pre-industrial. It might in a pre-industrial society. That being said, there are some principles that can still be applied to our society today. A number of them, and this isn't, again, it's not a one-to-one correlation, but there are a lot of things that he's noticed in industrial societies that tend to affect these instability events. One of which is what he calls elite overproduction. So, in any given society, there's only X number of elite jobs, right? Like jobs for educated people that pay well, etc. If we promise free college to everyone, right, which is a very noble goal. But then if we stop having blue-collar workers and everybody wants to be in management, there aren't going to be any workers anymore, and there aren't going to be enough spots for the people that studied to be in management who didn't study to be a welder or a plumber, etc. And so those people are going to become disenfranchised. There's going to be those people are going to make enemies with the people that did get the jobs, and there's going to be greater instability due to that factor. He says, furthermore, over the past 200 years, political instability in the United States has waxed and waned in a pattern reminiscent of that in pre-industrial societies. Political violence, urban riots, lynchings, violent labor disputes, and so on was almost absent in the early 19th century, increased from the 1830s, and reached a peak in around 1900. The American Civil War occurred during this period of growing unrest. The instability then subsided during the 1930s, and the following 2 decades were remarkably calm. Finally, in the 1960s, political violence increased again. He emphasizes that cliodynamics can't predict the future, rather. But what it can do is it can inform our decisions and the policies that we make to ensure that we don't effect a policy that might actually generate political instability in a way that we hadn't anticipated. And that is one of the benefits of what he calls this science. And that's part of why I'm making this series, is to determine whether or not that's a valid claim. And so I'm interested to go further, and I hope you are as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll be posting again soon.